Welcome to the Immigration Insights podcast. I am your host, Kate Kalmykov, and the podcast is brought to you by the Global Immigration and Compliance Group at Greenberg, Traurig, which I am honored to co-chair. Today, we're going to have an incredibly timely and interesting discussion on global mobility in motion and trends shaping the future of global mobility. I am extremely excited to be joined today by Jason Rogers of Newland Chase. And Jason is a senior partner at Newland Chase Advisory Services, where he leads a counsel team and provides high-level consultations to corporations on employee immigration and mobility strategies. We are lucky enough at GT to work very closely with Newland Chase on behalf of our clients, sending employees all over the world. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love it if you can give us a little bit more information on your practice.
Thank you, Kate. And again, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to speak on behalf of Newland Chase Advisory today. So as you said, yes, I've been practicing in the area of global immigration, global mobility, HR compliance for over 20 years. So I've started at a Big Four firm and saw kind of how the world was changing. This is around 2000, 2002. And since then have built my practice really around, everything outside of the US and how the interaction of both the employers who have entities here in the US and then those who truly are global and operate around the world, how to use global mobility, how to use immigration to their advantage, but at the same time, keeping in mind those compliance issues that are ever more, present and more creeping into the workspace today. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this very, as you said, very timely topic today.
And let's dive right in. So let's talk about global mobility and the evolving role that it has in working with companies, both big and small, in meeting their workforce needs. A lot of the companies we work for have a global footprint. We are living in an era of free trade, even though there's much talk of tariffs. And there is definitely a race for global talent and a lot of competition for it. So tell us a little bit about, in your 20 years of practice, how you have seen global mobility really evolve.
I think, just looking back over the past 20 years, huge, leaps and bounds. I think, 20 years ago, it really was a time when U.S. companies were looking to expand, their markets. We were getting access to China. Maybe for the first time, a lot of the other developing countries were opening up. We were coming off, Europe was kind of exploding in terms of their growth. We had a lot of growth happening in Latin America. And maybe just the very beginning thoughts of how, those countries and some of those Middle Eastern countries would kind of develop their strategy outside of just, focusing on the oil trade. So, 20 years ago, I think companies, especially looking at not only their talent pool, but just their customer base, the world is very connected now. And I think technology has brought us so far in the past 20 years that, where we used to live in silos inside of our own little worlds of, the US or Europe or, Latin America or, Asia Pacific, those silos have been, completely destroyed with technology. The ease of travel, the cost of travel is down, the cost of shipping of goods is down. So I think, as companies looked to grow their businesses, it was only natural to look at those, countries outside of the U.S. where, there was a huge consumer base. And so certainly with China opening up, India and their developing economies, Europe and their powerhouse economies were natural just kind of destinations for companies to look. And with that, as you said, the need for talent. Here in the U.S., we don't have enough employees with the skill sets always necessary to run a truly global company. And so, companies started looking at immigration and mobilities as ways to not only get that talent, but then use it as almost, a reward for their key talent to keep it and use it. And I think at the same time, you were looking at companies knowing that to be truly successful as an employee and personal development, you really needed to get different aspects and different, kind of experiences outside of the US. And so how could we send our managers around the world and kind of get to know our consumers in Europe? How do we understand our consumers, in Asia and their needs so we can create products, here in the US or wherever our manufacturing takes place, to meet those global needs. So I think as companies, looked at the world, they started seeing endless possibilities. And with that, we have kind of created, a mobility industry now that's, worth billions of dollars.
And, in my experience, 20 years ago, when we talked about global mobility and sending employees out, it involved finding local counsel, working with relocation companies on the logistics of moving people. And now we really see, I think, the evolution of it as just a work strategy for companies. We are going to place employees where it makes sense, where we're developing markets, where it's cost efficient, and we want you to give us the whole package. And it's so important to support their needs. I think COVID even a little bit prompted, even more reliance on sending people abroad. And a lot of visa options evolved, I think, overseas as well, with the digital nomad visas and a lot more flexibility for really promoting a global workforce.
I think that's, exactly true. I think with, certainly since COVID, in some of the years leading up to COVID, especially as we saw technologies kind of really allow individuals to work anywhere that they wanted to. Employers may not have liked it at first, and many employers are, maybe not always happy with that prospect. But I think they saw that to have a happy employee and a productive employee, maybe technology did allow them to work, outside of their normal office, whether it was a domestic remote working destination or, what's stopping me from traveling my dream, to some Caribbean island and, putting up my toes in the sand and doing my work there. If I'm being productive, employers, were very kind of hesitant to embrace it. But I think, there was that period where it really took off, right before COVID. And then, as you said, immediately after COVID. And unfortunately, technology generally has always advanced much faster than immigration rules and the regulations. Generally that takes time. But we saw, within maybe a 2-year, 3-year time spell, companies really starting to see visa options come into play that had never really crossed their mind. As you said, remote visas and allowing people to kind of self-sponsor themselves in locations where, there was no entity, whether that be, the digital nomad visas using employers of record as a kind of an option, or using maybe short-term visa options to allow someone to go in for 90 days, 180 days, depending upon the destination, and kind of remote working as a tourist. So those things that kind of maybe employees had been doing under the radar, for many years, once they had the technology and the means to do so, I think governments finally said it's happening. We might as well regulate it, allow us to monitor it, collect taxes and other kind of benefits for us. And so we're starting to see, countries embrace the technology in the sense of their immigration policies as well, and really expanding what can and cannot be done in those, associated visa categories.
Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing lately is also a shift in U.S. immigration. Certainly, this administration came in with an agenda that very much focused on immigration. And as of January 2025, we have seen a lot of executive orders aimed at both business immigration and non-business immigration. But I think a lot of companies are now evaluating what types of visas can they use to bring employees to the U.S. and can any of those visas meet their criteria? Because in some cases, the employees do not fall into the U.S. visa categories. Costs have significantly gone up. In the U.S. immigration world, we've been abuzz with the H-1B proclamation that the administration passed in September, imposing a new $100,000 fee for H-1Bs that are overseas coming to the U.S. So many employers are coming to us and asking us to work with them to develop a global mobility strategy to move employees to their other hubs, or to even open other hubs for them where the visa regimes are perhaps more friendly. So what have you seen at Newland Chase in terms of destination and also volume in that respect?
Well, I would say this topic has has really kept me and my team busy these past few months. I think, before the new administration started in January, we had a sense of what his second term might look like based upon, the first term and what, the issues that we saw during those 4 years. I think so. We were framing our kind of service offerings and our planning around what we expected to happen in the U.S. And certainly, I think what we expected to happen is starting to really play out. But I think at the same time, it's important to also understand that in 2024, the U.S., I think, was only one of maybe 70 or 80 countries around the world that had global or truly national elections and where their national leader, whether it be a president or prime minister, was elected. And I think in all of those instances, at least 65% of those instances, we saw that, the shift in terms of the government completely switched, whether it was a right-leaning government before, switched to the left-leaning policies are now to right in terms of governments. And so what we are seeing in the U.S. is something we're seeing, all around the world. And so while it's been exciting to work on these, kind of strategies with clients, we've also been working in an atmosphere where, yes, the U.S. is restricted and closing down, or it may feel that way. But a lot of those key destinations that companies traditionally have looked to also experiencing kind of that same shift. So, historically, Canada was always kind of that first destination for companies who had operations in Canada or who wanted to kind of park their employees somewhere within kind of the same geographical locations as the U.S. It was just literally last night, the Canadian government announced that they were slashing, their 2026 temporary visa category down by over 300,000 new visas. So we're seeing restrictions in place there. But at the same time, as countries like that have kind of restricted, and the UK, another popular destination, we've seen their filing fees this year, increase. So we're maybe a 1-year assignment now in terms of filing fees, and some of the other surcharges can add an additional 10 to 12,000 pounds, per employee for a 1-year assignment. So it's getting, expensive everywhere. But I think what these other countries are starting to notice, and what we are seeing our clients do, is while they are overall kind of being restricted in terms of their immigration program, they're seeing an opportunity to get key talent that had traditionally landed in the U.S. to their shores. So we're seeing Canada, for instance, opening up their global talent stream, which is a promise to process visas within 2 weeks. We're seeing a lot of exemptions for labor market tests and countries to allow those, kind of skilled individuals to come in. So what we're seeing with clients is that urge now to take advantage of some of these programs outside of the U.S. to locate their employees. So whether it's opening up, I've done this for 2 clients, actually. They've opened up data centers in Ireland and have moved talent from the U.S. to Ireland. The cost of living is lower. There's the ability, since Ireland is still part of the EU, to use an Irish passport, or an Irish work and residence permit for short-term assignments throughout Europe. So the tax rate for corporations are lower. So we're seeing companies really at a very high strategic level look to these locations to see where the cost of talent is lower, where the tax provisions for the employer at the corporate side is much lower than the U.S., where the fees are lower, and this where just the overall atmosphere towards immigration is much more positive. So while we have seen overall more restrictions in place for countries, we're seeing them, while they're being restricted, kind of open up to talent and skilled workers. So there's a lot of press around, shutting down and getting tight in some of these locations. But if you actually read the regulations and what's going on, they're always carving out something to kind of take advantage of what's happening here in the U.S. to kind of get that talent to their shore while, the difficulties here in the U.S. persist.
So let's talk about some hotspots and give specifics, right? So Eastern Europe, Poland.
I would say in terms of Eastern Europe, Poland, we have seen the past couple of years, it's really just exploded. It's really become kind of a destination for IT, for kind of shared services, for the fintech industries. And in 2025, we saw Poland completely do away with the need for labor market test. And they've also put in place regulations for the promise that work permit applications will be processed, I think, within like 30 days of filing. Traditionally, Poland would file an application. It could take, 4 to 6 months to get it through based upon doing the labor market test and then just the bureaucracy of the application process itself. But we've seen the Polish government kind of come in and say, we're doing away with the labor market test. You file, we promise to get you a decision within 30 days. And, just the cost of living in terms of how far a salary will go in Poland, versus here in the US or in Western Europe is a lot stronger. So, we've seen a lot of companies started to turn to Poland. And if you look at just the local Polish workforce itself, they are educated. Many of their individuals speak multiple languages. So they're able to deal with, truly global companies who, have multinationals working for them. And they have seen and used immigration, while they've been very restricted in terms of some of the refugee asylum cases, just based upon some of the numbers that they experienced at the beginning of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. They've really noticed that while we need to be restricted when it comes to getting that skilled labor in, here's our time to shine. We have the resources, we have that staff and the desire for it, and so they really have eliminated a lot of those challenges.
We are also seeing that, and we have a Warsaw office that is extremely busy, likewise helping large multinational companies in Poland. Another hot area where we see a lot of growth and a lot of movement is the Middle East, particularly the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which obviously is trying to attract a lot of talent, a lot of investment, a lot of global companies. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say, in the UAE, especially Dubai, Abu Dhabi, it has historically been very favorable in terms of kind of the benefits of being an expat, a foreign national in that location. And I think we have seen, those countries, especially the UAE, more recently, Saudi Arabia, kind of almost lean into that, trying to lure, executives, especially to relocate there and to bring their teams with them. I think, we've seen the introduction of golden visas, especially for new investors. And, I think that will allow individuals to come in for up to 10 years, almost sponsor free, to allow, individuals who are maybe in their mid-career to kind of take a pause from their day-to-day corporate life and go to the UAE, for example, and really invest in something new and to work with local UAE industries. I think, there are tax advantages certainly in the UAE that kind of has attracted this as well. But we have seen, the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in terms of just allowing that golden investment type visa for individuals to come in. But at the same time, it's always been very favorable for more employer-based work authorizations. There's a lot of freedom given to local employers to bring in that talent, and some of maybe the traditional visa types that might tie an employee to an employer for 5 to 10 years. A lot of governments have recognized that that's a hindrance for relocation into those, especially the Saudi Arabia recently. So they've kind of eliminated that need to stay tied to an employer for so long. So I think, talent that's looking for a location, in the Middle East, I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia especially, both have really embraced that kind of attitude to get in investors in individually, but also, get in employers as well to expand, the industries within both countries beyond just the oil and gas, which have, traditionally dominated both economies.
And of course, the tax benefits of going there are so tremendous.
The tax benefits are very kind of lucrative and attractive to a foreign national coming in. I'm no tax expert, but I hear, there's quite a lot of advantages. So certainly I think for individuals who are either sent there to become localized or are sent on expat assignments, the tax advantages is something that really helps them deal with, the 120-degree heat during the hotter months of the year. I think it's much easier to deal with.
And the speed at which they process visas is just amazing. I know in Dubai, it's 24 hours, and the golden visa has been a game changer since it was introduced. And other, countries in the region like Oman, like Bahrain, are also following suit because they see the success and the caliber of people that are being, driven to these places to really contribute to the local economies, to open businesses, to operate existing businesses that are opening offices in the UAE or Saudi.
Exactly. And I think, as those countries have really only come to the forefront the past 10 to 12 years in terms of being popular destinations, they have been able to create their immigration system with the most modern technology. So as you said, individuals can expect, if not instant approval, generally within 24 hours. There's a lot of freedom to, obtain employers themselves have a lot of freedom to do the filing themselves and control the actions. It's less bureaucratic and more in the hands of the employer, who have access online to the various ministries' databases. They're uploading the documents, they're issuing the visas. So it's very pro-employer friendly in terms of just even those visa types where you're sponsoring employers.
Let's talk a little bit about Asia. Obviously, huge population, super talented across Asia. And you talked a little bit about China and India opening up. Obviously, for U.S. employers and transferring employees, cost is an important factor. Location for where they may have staff already is an important factor. So what trends are you seeing in Asia, and what are the hotspots?
So I think you can't talk about Asia without talking about China first. It has the world's largest, in terms of consumer base. It's the largest in terms of population. And so any company who truly wants to be successful on the global stage will at least have some type of footprint or touch China in some way. And what we saw, especially the past 15 years, my first, I think, trip to Shanghai was maybe 12 or 13 years ago, and just the speed at which the country's immigration process, the regulations kind of evolved up until the time of COVID was unbelievable. Every year I would go back and it would seem like the regulation were clearer, the processes were stronger. And then, we were in a very strong point of understanding the Chinese immigration system. With COVID, however, and some of the lockdowns and some of those challenges that China faced, a lot of employers were weary of sending employers there on assignment or even on business trips. And I think, especially maybe the past 2.5 years, we've seen China and the Chinese government say, we are welcome for business. And what can we do to, put your mind at ease? What can we do to get your foreign national talent back to the country? And so we've seen, really at a great speed, all of their processes moving online. We're seeing, almost daily, we get a news alert that, visa-free travel for business up to 30 days are being, the visa requirement is being waived. I think just yesterday, Swedish nationals no longer need a visa to stay in China for business for up to 30 days. So I think just the US and the UK kind of are the two major countries where those restrictions of getting an actual paper visa are in place. So China has really put forth an effort, maybe in the past 18 months, to get that talent back and making it easier to renew work permits inside the country. They're being renewed for longer periods of time. So the Chinese government, I think, are really welcoming foreign nationals now. And I would not be surprised if corporations and employers start taking advantage of that. I think at the same time, if you look at Japan, historically, Japan has always been quite restricted when it comes to immigration. But it has a population that's aging. And, within the next 20 to 25 years, there certainly will not be able to meet their technology, their employer needs in terms of just local talent. And so a government that 10 years ago was very restricted in terms of allowing people not only access in terms of needing labor market opinions, higher salary requirements, maybe more difficulty in getting permanent residency, and long-term standing in Japan. We've seen the Japanese government do a complete 180, and now they are, quite welcoming in terms of allowing in foreign talent. Those salary requirements have come down drastically. We're seeing the ease at which foreign nationals can, enter and then obtain permanent residency has really eased as well. So I think those two locations have been really active the past 2 or 3 years to kind of evolve and kind of create almost a completely different new attitude towards immigration. But at the same time, you're looking at countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, where a lot of manufacturing has taken place. In those countries, I always joke about Vietnam. Historically, it would take 28 or 29 different steps from start to finish in terms of their immigration process. And it was, just a very bureaucratic nightmare in terms of just trying to operate there. But we're seeing, the Vietnamese process is now online. It's being streamlined, from city to city and throughout the country. It's no longer so regionalized. So countries really started to embrace the need for not only technology, but to make it easier. Because there's nothing kind of like a barrier in terms of relocating talent than to say, oh, it's going to take 6 to 9 months before we can get the immigration paperwork, in place. By then, the business needs or the business opportunity could have completely passed. So, we're seeing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia really push for that 30 to 45 day decision window. And so I think that's really given confidence for companies to come in and invest in these locations if they think and they know and they see the proof that it would be quite easy to get that foreign talent in. I think also, Singapore has been kind of the financial hub of the region, for several decades at this point. Singapore has traditionally always been, I would say, easy in the sense of how the process works. It was very much online. It was very regulated in terms of the government says it will take 7 days. You could expect a decision in 7 days. But even, with Singapore and some of the kind of talent drain they've seen to other APAC locations, they have, kind of embraced the need to make their process not easier, because it was always from a process standpoint been easier, but to just qualify for some of their permits, they've made it much easier and have lowered the standards in terms of salary, educational requirements to get that talent in so that people can develop their careers in Singapore. Then at the same time, we've seen Australia almost do the same. There was a big push maybe 6 to 7 years ago to really restrict individuals in terms of Australian immigration. That was kind of the focus of their government. The job categories that could support a foreign national were very limited. And even within that limited number of jobs, only a very few number could then eventually apply and obtain permanent residency in Australia. But the government, the recent government, maybe 2.5 years ago, have again completely changed that around. Now, more job and job categories are open to allowing foreign nationals to hold those visas. And almost, all visa categories now can eventually lead to permanent residency in Australia. So I think governments throughout Asia have seen the need to not only attract that talent, but to keep it, because they really are, operating in the sense that their local population is aging. Technology and the skill sets are becoming, higher, and demand for that trained talent is becoming higher all the time. And, if they get foreign nationals on their soil, they want to make it, very attractive and very easy at the same time to obtain that permanent residency so that they have that talent there long term.
What about India? A lot of companies obviously have operations in India, rely on outsourcing work to India. How does it work there?
So India, I would say it's simple in the fact that there's really one visa category. There's the employment visa for India. So unlike the US that would have the O's, the J's, the L's, the H's, all of the different categories, India has historically only had their employment visa. It's generally has always been valid for 1 year. You would renew it every year. And it's always kind of been the status quo when it comes to the Indian immigration process. It was also a consulate driven process. So you would file at the Indian consulate with jurisdiction over you, but especially for truly global companies who had employees applying for the employment visa around the world, the experience, the processing time, the required documents, would vary greatly from country to country and consulate to consulate. And so what the government of India has really focused on is streamlining their visa and immigration programs around the world. So you find a much standardized kind of immigration experience now for immigration to India. Employers have probably a sense of just ease at which they now know what the process will look like, whether they're applying at a consulate in Atlanta, in Houston, in London, in Tokyo. The process, the experience, the required documentation, the processing time, will all be very similar now. And we're also seeing the ability to extend the employment visa inside India continue, kind of with the same ease, but it's instead of being granted for 1 year at a time, companies are being more successful at getting it for 2 to 3 to 4 years at a time. So there's less immigration bureaucracy that's happening. So I think India, again, really is the one standardized process, but they're trying to streamline it and make it, much easier in terms of just customer experience and just the ease at which employers can plan when it comes to timelines, required documentations, et cetera.
Really, I want to get your thoughts on LATAM, right? We have a lot of clients with operations in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, other countries. Can you comment on that?
I think, Latin American countries have historically they've been popular destinations, but companies may not have always used them to their advantage as strategically as possible. For instance, if a company was looking at a geographical equivalent to the US, they might immediately think of Canada and maybe not Mexico or other Latin American countries. But I could say that Mexico and other Latin American countries have really embraced the kind of attitude that if the US can't retain the talent, if it's too expensive or difficult to obtain, work authorization in Canada, Mexico continues to be my number one recommendation for employers saying, where, can we park someone until they can return to the U.S. In terms of educational requirements, salary requirements, basically non-existent as long as they're offered a prevailing wage. I would say the ease at which Mexican immigration and permanent residency is quite valuable in terms of once you obtain that permanent residency, your ties to Mexico don't need to be as strong to maintain the permanent residency as you might find, maintaining your U.S. green card status, for example. And so just from a geographical standpoint, the ease of doing business, Mexico has been, a very kind of attractive location. I think other countries, though, within Latin America have kind of looked at that in Mexico and what they're doing to say, how can we kind of use what we have to offer to attract talent? I think Costa Rica this past year has kind of introduced a self-sponsored nomad visa type. The minimum salary per month, I think, is $2,500 that you have to earn or show that you earn from your employer in terms of, getting permanent or almost permanent residency in Costa Rica. Argentina has also come a long ways in terms of they introduced a golden visa for investors this past year as well. And instead of, the higher fees, I think it's around $100,000 that you have to invest in terms of Argentina in terms of getting that visa category. A lot of the bureaucracy that we have seen traditionally in Brazilian immigration, and then within the Mercosur agreement and those countries, they have really focused on efficiency in terms of cutting out the red tape. Again, Brazil used to be a process that required multiple documentations, a lot of apostilles, legalizations, translations. It is a very elaborate application package. And while the documentation and the supporting documents are still there, there's a lot. I would say the government has come a long ways in terms of just ease of presenting your application case in terms of Brazil. So I think those countries in Latin America have really kind of latched onto the idea that, you can be successful and not have to lower your standards of entry for foreign national talent. And we've really seen those countries really embrace that as well.
So thank you for that overview of the globe. It seems like there is definitely a trend towards opening up, towards allowing employees in, being business friendly. But there's things that employers also need to consider. Local employment laws, they definitely need to consult with local counsel to see what the obligations are in different countries, in terms of hiring, firing, conditions, salaries, things like that. Because just like they're regulated in the US, they're regulated all over the world. Certainly taxes and how people are taxed, whether it's the employees themselves that are being transferred or the company, are huge factors that need to be taken into account. And I think volatility. We have volatility around the globe. We have a lot of instability and things that occur that just aren't predicted in the news, from global conflicts to, all sorts of, environmental disasters and things like that. And it's very important for employers to also plan for that ahead of time. Nobody wants to think about global security and the risks involved because it is definitely not something you want to deal with. But in this world, it seems that it's definitely a must.
Absolutely. And I think, a piece of advice that I always give employers is to really know your population, whether it be your expat population. But I've been saying in terms of this instance, just those short-term assignments, those extended business trips, really know where your employees are at all times. A lot of times, especially with business trips, we see business managers just tell an employee, book a trip to the UK for 3 weeks. Nothing is really monitored in terms of where that employee is at any given time. So certainly to any mobility leader or team, always track your employees and know where they are. And as you said on those other points, there's a lot of differences in terms of employing someone in the US versus employing them, outside the US. A lot of countries are very pro-employee when it comes to benefits, rights, medical coverages, a lot of those topics that, your other service providers can assist you with. But just because you are able to employ someone in the Netherlands, for example, for the company doesn't mean from a financial standpoint, it's more advantageous. It could be quite more expensive to kind of look at some of these countries and have your employers there. So if you're looking to kind of base employees, you have to look at not only immigration, but also the tax, the social services, the health coverage, all of those that really come into play with a true global mobility program.
And speaking of a global mobility program, obviously there's the cost aspect, there's the employee considerations, there's local laws. But one of the things we also need to think about is technology and monitoring people. As you said, the easiest way to do that is with technology, knowing where your employees are, making sure they have access to their documentation, making sure you have access to their documentation. And I think as part of the tech, we also need to think about when we're transferring employees overseas, protecting company data and protecting the integrity of our IP.
Absolutely. I think, there is the sense that if I'm in a foreign country, even as a visitor or as a local resident, local law doesn't apply to me. I'm just using myself an example. I would say, I'm a U.S. citizen. I have my rights, but I, have to keep in mind that when I depart the U.S. and I'm on foreign soil, that I come subject to their laws and regulations. And a lot of countries aren't so concerned about privacy in terms of personal information and data, as well as company data. And if you are allowing your employees to work remote, this really has come up in the sense of those digital nomads and those remote employees who kind of are out there as their lone wolf in a location, is sensitive and proprietary information being shared online or up in the cloud that others have access to without your knowledge. And so if you're looking at, allowing individuals to work outside of a location where you feel secure, you really do also need to work closely with your IT teams to make sure that, emails, documents are protected at all times. Because I think we have all seen just the number of hacks and, kind of spamware instances of where company data has been stolen and databases hacked by governments. So if you're going to be allowing your employees to truly be mobile and work at locations, you have to make sure that you have the tech and the security to back that up.
I think AI is something also to take into account because that is moving at lightning speed, and it is definitely going to be a factor in both how it's used by employees and companies, but also in the global mobility process.
It is. I mean, I was at a mobility conference last week, and I think, every discussion at some point turned to AI in terms of whether it's just the visa process itself in terms of evaluating applications, whether it was the relocation aspect of staging homes and being able to look at neighborhoods virtually through goggles without, actually having to get on a trip and go explore the local neighborhood you might live in. So I think AI is really will certainly continue to evolve and play a huge kind of role in global mobility. But at the same time, the technology is still quite young. There is a lot of, false information within AI and chat rooms that you have to verify. Something may look very official and very, give us access to this database and you think it looks legit coming from a government. You allow them to, have access to your files, et cetera. So I think, with all the advantages of AI and technology, we continue to have to be cautious, make sure that any tools that you're using is something that your company approves and is something that can, be utilized outside of your country in a safe way. But I certainly think AI will cut down on processing times for visa applications. I think it will help employers kind of evaluate their employees' populations, their skill sets, where they need them to be in the world, very easily. I think it will help monitor and track where your employees are. But I think with any system, it's only as good as the information that you put in. So in creating your internal AI systems and chat features, et cetera, make sure the information you're putting into that closed environment is accurate and remains up to date.
And governments are also using AI not just to process visa applications, but to look at the backgrounds of people applying to come into their countries. And we heard it in the news in the US that certain visa revocations took place because AI was used to identify people who may not necessarily support the US online and in different postings.
Absolutely. And I think, October 12th is when the European Union exit entry system started or officially came into place. So now every, third country national going in or out of the EU will have their biometrics, their face, their fingerprint scanned every time upon entry, upon departure. So not only are governments tracking your days in country and those traditionally kind of your allowed number of days of stay, as a visitor, but they're also now sharing that information across many departments and many governments. So, tax departments now know which foreign nationals are in their country and who may meet that threshold of becoming a taxable citizen. Posted worker filings and that requirement, those individuals are getting involved. Same with Social Security coverage. So as a result of this tracking that's being done by governments and kind of almost the instantaneous reporting that's happening because of AI technology, where you've seen a huge increase in terms of site inspections outside of the US. So it's not uncommon for me to have 2 or 3 different audits going on at any time for clients, especially within the EU, recently and it's not just your traditional immigration audits, it's compliance audits around the right to work. Is there Social Security coverage in place? Can you show me proof that your employers are registered with the health insurance system? So I think as companies are moving individuals around, quickly and using technology in that way, just keep in mind that governments are also using technology to track, identify, and to kind of see when individuals may have overstayed or not have registered with the right departments, and governments will come after employers, without hesitation now.
Jason, what do you think is the future of global mobility over the course of the next 5 years?
I wish I knew. I think, I've seen a lot of change in 20 years. And, I guess the cynical small voice inside of me says with technology, maybe mobility will go away. But then when you actually just think about it and reflect, we can have the best technology. We can, have Zoom calls. We can speak to our colleagues 24/7 in terms of that. But there'll never be probably technology, I hope, that will eliminate the need for human interaction. And just the kind of advantage of being with your colleagues in a different office. So I think mobility and the global mobility world will continue to always exist. I do think we'll continue to see that push for shorter assignments. The traditional 2 to 3 year expat, moving the family, selling the house for you, giving you a driver, security, a fantastic apartment in a fantastic city. I think just with the cost of everything, those days are probably almost gone, except for maybe top level executives. But I think the ability and the need to move people around will never be eliminated. So I think we will continue to see efficiency. I think we will continue to see governments, allow short-term assignments with more ease. But I think with that, we have to look at other issues that touch mobility, housing, and there's housing shortages in a lot of metropolitan cities around the world, especially affordable housing, and kind of that dichotomy of housing individuals on a short-term basis. There's the environmental impact of moving individuals around. So I think a lot of these points will continue to be at the forefront of mobility leadership and what we can do to solve for them. But I think the need to move people will never go away. I just think maybe the duration and maybe kind of the benefits that go along with that will continue to evolve.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what we're going to see from the US side is greater collaboration between US legal teams and global mobility professionals coming up with comprehensive plans for relocation and really working closely together. I also think we are going to see processing improvements on the American side, because I think we're moving in that direction of improving our technology. It's hard to believe for many people that to date, we still file paper applications with the US immigration authorities. I think that's going to go away. Just last week, we moved to online payments for all applications for the first time. And I think we are sort of racing to catch up some of these other hubs, which are attracting employees by making the process more streamlined and easier. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our discussion. I think our viewers find it very timely and interesting. And obviously, we really appreciate the collaboration that we have with Newland Chase on working with you on behalf of our clients to help transfer their employees around the world.
Well, Kate, again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss. And yes, the partnership is fantastic. I enjoy working with you, your colleagues, and your clients, and always a pleasure speaking with you and getting your insight as well.